I know we have no right to stand here.
You left me outside in the rain when I was 17. Why are you here now?
About that night.
Then tell me the truth.
We should have told you 20 years ago.
What truth?
I lay awake for hours that night listening to muffled voices through my bedroom wall. My parents' voices rising and falling in a conversation I could not fully make out. At one point, I heard my mother's voice crack, asking my father something I could not quite hear, and I heard my father respond with a firmness that silenced her completely. I did not understand then what that conversation was truly about. I assumed it was about me, about what consequence I deserved for a theft I had not committed. It would be 20 years before I learned that conversation was not about my punishment at all. It was about whether my father would finally tell the truth, and whether my mother, faced with that truth, would be able to live with what it meant about the family she had spent her whole life protecting. I woke the next morning to an unfamiliar stillness in the house, the kind of silence that felt less like peace and more like the quiet before something breaks completely. My mother did not make breakfast that morning. My father had already left for work before I came downstairs, which was unusual for him, since he typically waited to drive me to school on his way. I remember standing in that empty kitchen, staring at the spot on the counter where my honor roll letter had once hung, now gone, and feeling a specific kind of dread settle into my stomach, the kind that comes from sensing a decision has already been made about you without your knowledge or your consent. School that day passed in a blur I still cannot fully recall, though I remember sitting through my art class, unable to focus on the still life in front of me, my mind circling back again and again to my father's silence at that dinner table. I kept telling myself that once emotions cooled, once my parents had a chance to think clearly, someone would realize how unfair the accusation had been. I held on to that hope the entire bus ride home, watching familiar houses pass by the window, rehearsing in my head exactly what I would say to make them understand. I had no idea that hope was about to be the last naive comfort of my childhood. I noticed the suitcase before I noticed anything else. It sat on the front porch, my suitcase, the same faded blue one I had used for a school trip 2 years earlier, packed and zipped, and placed beside the porch swing nobody ever used, like an object left out for garbage collection rather than a piece of my life. My hands went cold before my mind fully caught up with what I was seeing. I tried the front door, and it did not open. I tried it again, harder, rattling the handle the way you rattle something you refuse to believe is actually locked. Through the window, I could see my mother in the kitchen, her back turned toward me, washing a dish she did not need to wash, refusing to turn around. I knocked. I called out. I said, "Mom, Dad, please," in a voice that cracked in a way I had never heard my own voice crack before. And for a long, unbearable stretch of time, nobody answered at all. Rain had started to fall by then, cold and steady, soaking through my school jacket within minutes, and I remember standing on that porch thinking, with a strange and sudden clarity, that whatever was happening was not a misunderstanding that would resolve itself by morning. This was a decision. Somebody inside that house had decided, deliberately, that I no longer belonged there, and had done it without a single word of explanation to my face. It was my father who finally opened the door, just enough to speak to me through the narrow gap, his face unreadable in a way that frightened me more than anger would have. He told me, in a flat, rehearsed voice that did not sound like him at all, that I needed to stay somewhere else for a while, that they needed space to figure some things out as a family. I asked him what that meant, whether this was about the money, whether I could at least come inside out of the rain while we talked it through properly. He said my name once, quietly, Claire, and then he closed the door. I heard the lock turn from the inside, a small mechanical click that somehow felt louder than anything my mother had screamed the night before. I stood on that porch for nearly 20 minutes, soaked through completely, staring at a front door I had walked through thousands of times without ever once imagining it could be closed against me. I did not cry at first. I remember feeling strangely calm, the kind of calm that comes right before your body understands what your mind has not yet accepted. It was Ruth Callahan, drawn outside by the sound of my knocking, who finally crossed the yard between our houses in her raincoat and gently took the suitcase from my hand, guiding me toward her porch light without asking a single question I was not yet ready to answer. Ruth's kitchen smelled like cinnamon and old coffee, and she set a towel around my shoulders before she said a single word, letting me sit at her table shivering while the rain kept falling outside her window. I remember staring at the steam rising off the mug of tea she placed in front of me, unable to explain what had just happened because I did not fully understand it myself. Ruth did not press me. She simply sat across from me in silence, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand, until I finally found enough words to tell her that my parents had locked me out of my own house, and that I did not know what I was supposed to do next, because 17-year-olds are not supposed to have to know things like that. Ruth made 2 phone calls that night, though I did not learn the full content of either one until years later. The first was to my mother, a conversation Ruth described to me only briefly, saying simply that Diane was not ready to talk. The second call I was not aware of at all until it mattered much later in this story. A call to a number Ruth had written down and tucked away, one she told herself she was keeping only in case of an emergency. I did not think to ask why a retired schoolteacher next door would already have a plan in place for a situation like mine. I was 17, soaked through, and grateful simply to have somewhere warm to sit for the night. Ruth let me sleep in her guest room that first night, and for 3 days after that, believing, the same as I did, that this was temporary, a misunderstanding that cooler heads would eventually resolve. On the 4th day, when I finally worked up the courage to walk back to my own house and ask my mother directly what was happening, I found the porch swing gone and a for sale sign nowhere in sight, meaning they had not moved, meaning they were simply choosing, day after day, not to let me back inside. My mother answered the door that time, her eyes red-rimmed and refusing to meet mine directly, and told me that it would be best for everyone if I stayed with Ruth for now, that my father needed time, that things were complicated in ways I would not understand yet. I asked her what things. She would not answer me. She simply repeated that it would be best, closed the door gently, and left me standing on the same porch for the second time in less than a week. I want to pause here and tell you something I did not understand until much later in my life, something that took me 2 decades and a great deal of therapy to fully accept. My mother's refusal to explain herself that day was not simply cruelty. It was the behavior of a woman who did not yet know how to explain something she herself did not fully understand, a woman caught between a husband she trusted and a truth that was beginning to unravel just outside her awareness. I did not know that yet, standing soaked and rejected on that porch for the second time. I only knew that whatever I had done to deserve this, nobody in my family was willing to tell me, and that not knowing was its own particular kind of cruelty, one that would follow me for the next 20 years of my life. Ruth Callahan became, in every way that mattered, my mother for the next several years, though neither of us ever used that word out loud. She could not legally take custody of a minor without involving the state, and I remember the long conversation we had at her kitchen table about what that would mean, about foster care, about group homes, about the very real possibility that speaking up formally about my situation could land me somewhere far worse than a spare bedroom next door to the only house I had ever known. We made a quiet decision together that night, one that older readers of this story will understand better than most. I would stay with Ruth informally, finish out my last year and a half of high school enrolled under my parents' address on paper, and simply survive, one day at a time, without drawing the kind of attention that might separate me from the one adult who had actually shown up for me. I got a job that winter at a diner off Route 9, working under the table 3 evenings a week and every Saturday, standing on my feet for hours refilling coffee for truckers and retirees who tipped in loose change and occasionally kindness. My manager was a woman named Carol who never asked why a high school junior needed cash badly enough to work those hours. She simply scheduled me generously and let me eat the leftover pie at the end of my shifts. I remember counting my tips at Ruth's kitchen table each night, setting aside a portion for the small rent I insisted on paying her despite her repeated refusals, because accepting charity without contributing felt like one more way of being a burden, and I had learned, painfully, exactly how quickly a family could decide you were too much of one. Marcus came by Ruth's house exactly once during that first year, in the spring, driving a car I recognized as our father's. I remember opening the door and seeing him standing there, hands in his pockets, looking almost bored by the whole situation. And for one foolish moment, I let myself believe he had come to apologize, to explain, to somehow fix the thing that had broken between our family and me. Instead, he told me, in the same flat tone I remembered our father using at that locked door, that Mom and Dad had done what was best for everyone, that I should stop making things difficult by staying angry, and that I would understand someday when I had kids of my own. I did not cry in front of him. I waited until his car pulled out of Ruth's driveway before I let myself fall apart completely, because even at 17, some part of me understood that Marcus had not come to comfort me. He had come to make sure I stayed quiet. There was a moment that spring, one I have never told many people, where everything nearly collapsed entirely. Carol cut my hours at the diner after a slow season, and the small room I had started renting above a hardware store downtown, the one I had moved into that January to give Ruth back her guest room and some privacy, fell 2 weeks behind on rent. I remember standing outside that hardware store in April, calculating and recalculating numbers in my head that simply would not add up, understanding for the first time exactly how close 17-year-olds can come to genuine homelessness when the family that is supposed to catch them has instead become the reason they are falling. Ruth found out 3 days later, not because I told her, but because she noticed I had stopped eating properly, and she marched over to that hardware store herself and paid the landlord directly before I could stop her, telling me afterward, in a voice that allowed no argument, that pride was a luxury I was not yet allowed to afford. I finished high school on time, walking across that graduation stage in June with Ruth sitting in the audience instead of my parents, clapping loud enough, she told me later, to make up for the 2 empty seats beside her. I remember scanning the crowd anyway, some small, stubborn part of me still hoping, even then, that my mother might have slipped in quietly at the back to watch. She had not. Neither had my father. Marcus had not bothered either. It was Ruth Callahan, a widow with no legal obligation to me whatsoever, who took me to dinner that night and told me, over a plate of spaghetti at a restaurant I could never have afforded on my own, that she was proud of me, and that this, whatever came next, was only the very beginning of my story, not the ending my family seemed to have already written for me. College felt impossible in those first months after graduation, not because I lacked the grades. My transcript from that final year was strong enough to open real doors, but because tuition required a family financial statement I could not provide without contacting parents who had made it clear I no longer counted as part of their household. I remember sitting in a community college financial aid office that August, explaining my situation to a counselor named Mrs. Patterson, watching her expression shift from polite confusion to genuine concern as I laid out, as plainly as I could, that my parents were alive, reachable, and simply unwilling to acknowledge me. She was the one who introduced me to a specific designation for students like me, and helped me file the paperwork that finally let me apply for aid based on my own circumstances rather than a family that had already erased me from theirs. I enrolled at the community college that fall studying graphic design, the closest practical path I could find to the art that had always been the one language entirely mine. I worked mornings at the diner, took classes in the afternoons, and spent most evenings at Ruth's kitchen table with a laptop she had helped me buy secondhand, building a portfolio one project at a time. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from building an entire life with no safety net beneath you, and I remember those years less as individual events and more as a steady, grinding determination, the sense that stopping, even for a moment, was not an option I could afford to consider. It was during my second year of community college that I met David Reyes in a shared elective on marketing that neither of us particularly needed for our majors. David was studying business, the son of a restaurant owner on the east side of town, easygoing in a way that felt almost foreign to me after years of walking through the world braced for disappointment. He asked me out for coffee after our third class together, and I remember turning him down twice before finally agreeing. Not because I did not like him, but because I had genuinely forgotten, somewhere in the previous 2 years, how to let anyone get close enough to matter. David was patient with that in a way I did not fully appreciate until much later, never pushing, simply showing up consistently, week after week, until showing up stopped feeling unusual and started feeling like something I could actually rely on. I transferred my design portfolio to a 4-year program 2 years later, graduating with honors in a ceremony where Ruth once again sat in the audience, joined that time by David, who had by then become a fixture in my life in the quiet, steady way certain people become permanent without anyone announcing it formally. I did not invite my parents to that graduation. I did not send an announcement. Some part of me had finally stopped waiting by then. Though I would be lying if I told you the waiting disappeared completely, it simply moved somewhere quieter, somewhere I stopped checking as often. It was that same year, not long after graduation, that Ruth received a diagnosis that would test everything I had built in the years since that rain-soaked porch. Her doctor found early signs of a serious illness during a routine visit, the kind of news that arrives on an ordinary Tuesday and rearranges every plan you thought you had. I remember sitting beside her in that examination room, holding her hand the way she had once held mine at her kitchen table, understanding immediately, without needing to be told, that whatever plans I had for my own future were about to change shape entirely, because Ruth Callahan had never once hesitated when I needed her, and I was not about to hesitate now that she needed me. The job offer arrived 3 weeks after Ruth's diagnosis, and I have never quite forgiven timing for the cruelty of that particular coincidence. A design firm in Seattle had seen my senior portfolio through a professor's recommendation and flown me out for 2 rounds of interviews, offering me, at 23 years old, a position that would have paid more than double anything available to me in Ohio, along with relocation assistance and the kind of mentorship opportunity design graduates spend years chasing. I remember sitting in my car in that Seattle parking garage after the final interview, holding my phone, staring at an offer letter that represented everything I had worked towards since that first job at the diner, and feeling, for the first time in years, that the life I had built entirely from nothing might actually be about to open wide in front of me. I flew home that same week to find Ruth thinner than I remembered, though she insisted, in her characteristically stubborn way, that she was managing fine on her own and that I should take the Seattle position without a second thought. I sat with that decision for 11 days, longer than I have ever deliberated over anything before or since, turning it over from every possible angle, calling David late at night to talk through options that never quite resolved into anything simple. The math of it was straightforward on paper. Ruth had no children of her own, no other family nearby, and a treatment schedule that would require someone reliable nearby for months, possibly longer. The woman who had opened her door to a soaked, abandoned 17-year-old girl without asking a single question now needed someone to open a door for her, and I understood, somewhere around day 9 of that deliberation, that there was actually only one decision I could make and still recognize myself afterward. I called the Seattle firm on a Thursday afternoon and declined the offer, thanking them sincerely while my voice shook in a way I hoped they could not hear over the phone. I did not regret that decision then, and I have never regretted it since, though I would be dishonest if I told you it did not cost me something real, a version of my career that might have unfolded faster, a life in a different city I sometimes still wonder about. What it gave me instead was 18 months by Ruth's side through treatment, driving her to appointments, sitting with her through the worst of it, watching her slowly recover into the sharp, stubborn woman I had first met at that kitchen table years earlier. It gave me something else too, something I did not fully appreciate until much later, the beginning of a local reputation as a designer who stayed, who built relationships instead of chasing the next opportunity, a reputation that would eventually matter more than I could have predicted that Thursday afternoon on the phone. It was during Ruth's recovery, in a small, easily overlooked moment I nearly forgot entirely, that she mentioned receiving a letter from someone connected to my old house, someone from your old life, she called it, folding a piece of paper back into her cardigan pocket before I could ask to see it clearly. I remember asking her, almost absently, who would be writing to her from that direction after all these years, and Ruth simply waved the question away, telling me it was nothing worth discussing, that some doors were better left exactly as closed as I had already made peace with them being. I did not press her further that day. I had a job search to focus on, a life to keep rebuilding, and no particular appetite for reopening a chapter one believed, at the time, was permanently finished. I had no idea that letter was the very first thread of a story that would not fully unravel for another 15 years. I built my design career the slow, deliberate way, starting with freelance clients found through word of mouth, small local businesses that needed logos and websites. Each project a rung on a ladder I was constructing entirely by hand. David and I married 4 years after that Seattle decision, in a modest ceremony in Ruth's backyard, the same backyard where she had once handed me tea and a towel on the worst night of my life. Ruth walked me down a short aisle of folding chairs that afternoon, since I had no father willing to do it, and I remember thinking, watching her arm loop through mine, that family had never once been about blood in the way I had been raised to believe it was. It had been about who actually showed up, consistently, without being asked twice. Our daughter Sophia was born 3 years into our marriage, and I remember holding her for the first time in that hospital room, overwhelmed by a fierce, immediate protectiveness that made me finally understand, with a clarity that nearly broke me, exactly how wrong my own parents' choices had been. No amount of missing money, no amount of family complication, could have justified locking a child of mine out into the cold rain, and holding Sophia that first night, I made a quiet, private promise that whatever mistakes I made raising her, that particular one would never be among them. David watched me make that promise silently, understanding, without my needing to explain, exactly where it came from. My design business grew steadily through Sophia's early years, expanding from freelance work into a small studio with 2 employees, then 4, then enough steady contracts that I finally opened a real office downtown, the same glass-fronted building that would, years later, become the backdrop for a rain-soaked reunion I could not have imagined at the time. I built that studio's reputation on precisely the values Ruth had modeled for me: reliability, honesty, showing up for clients the way she had shown up for me. And by the time Sophia turned 8, Whitfield Design Group had become one of the more recognized names in the regional industry. My name, the one my parents had once tried to erase, now etched into brushed steel by an elevator bank downtown. I heard fragments about my birth family over those years, secondhand and infrequent, filtered through the small-town grapevine that never quite disappears no matter how far you think you have moved beyond it. Marcus, I learned, had drifted from job to job well into his 30s, still living at home longer than made sense for a grown man, still borrowing money that friends of friends whispered was never repaid. My father, according to those same fragments, had grown quieter over the years, withdrawn in a way that struck former neighbors as unusual for a man who had once been talkative and social. My mother, people said, had started attending church more regularly, sitting alone in a pew near the back, though nobody could say for certain what had prompted the change. I absorbed these fragments the way you absorb news about strangers, with a distant, almost clinical curiosity, because that family, the one on Maple Ridge Lane, had stopped feeling like mine to worry about a very long time ago. I want to be honest with you about something, because this story only works if I am. There were nights, even deep into my 30s, with a thriving business and a daughter of my own and a husband who loved me steadily, when I still dreamed about that porch, still woke with the specific, physical memory of rain soaking through my school jacket and a locked door refusing to open. Some wounds do not close simply because your life eventually improves around them. They simply learn to sit quietly beneath the surface, waiting, whether you want them to or not, for the day something finally forces them back into the light. For me, that day arrived on an ordinary Tuesday in October, 20 years almost to the week since I had last stood locked outside that house, when a black Mercedes pulled into the parking garage beneath my office building, carrying two people I had spent 2 decades trying not to need. That Tuesday began like any other. I remember sitting at my desk on the 9th floor reviewing final concepts for a client presentation, Sophia's school picture propped on my desk, beside a coffee Sophia had insisted on decorating with too many sprinkles that morning, David texting from the restaurant, he now managed to ask what time I would be home. I had no reason to suspect that anything unusual was unfolding 4 floors beneath me, in the parking garage where a car had been idling for nearly 20 minutes without either occupant finding the courage to step out into the rain. My assistant, a sharp young woman named Priya, knocked on my office door around 4 that afternoon with an expression I did not immediately recognize, a mixture of confusion and hesitation that made me set down my pen before she even spoke. She told me there were 2 people in the lobby asking for me by name. An older couple, she said, who claimed to be family, though they had not given a clear reason for the visit. I remember the specific, physical sensation that moved through my body at the word family, a coldness that had nothing to do with the office air conditioning, because in 20 years, nobody from that side of my life had ever once shown up anywhere I could be found, and some part of me understood immediately, before I even reached the elevator, that whatever had brought them here after 2 decades of silence was not going to be simple. I took the elevator down alone, watching the floor numbers tick past in a silence that felt louder than any sound could have been, rehearsing and discarding a dozen different versions of what I might say, what expression I would allow myself to wear, whether I would let them see anything at all of what this moment was costing me. When the doors opened into the lobby, I saw them immediately, standing near the reception desk, smaller somehow than I remembered them. My father's hair almost entirely gray now. My mother's shoulders curved forward in a way that spoke of years I had not been present to witness. Diane clutched that manila envelope against her chest with both hands, and for a long, suspended moment, none of us moved or spoke at all. 3 people standing in a marble lobby. 20 years of silence stretched taut between us like something that might finally, after all this time, be about to break. My father spoke first, his voice thinner than I remembered, worn down by 20 years in a way that surprised me more than it should have. He said my name, just Claire, nothing more, and I watched his throat work as though the rest of the sentence had gotten stuck somewhere behind it. My mother did not speak at all. She simply stood there clutching that envelope tighter against her chest, her eyes moving over my face with an expression I could not quite name, something between grief and disbelief, as though she was seeing not the 37-year-old woman standing in front of her, but the 17-year-old girl she had last watched through a rain-streaked window, and could not reconcile the two. I did not invite them up to my office immediately. I stood in that lobby for what felt like a very long time, giving myself space to decide whether I even wanted to hear whatever they had come to say, because I owed them nothing, not after 20 years, not after a locked door and a suitcase left on a porch like garbage. It was my father who finally broke the silence again, saying, "Please, Claire, just 5 minutes," in a voice so uncharacteristically small that something in me, despite every hardened instinct built over 2 decades, softened just enough to lead them toward the elevator instead of the exit. We sat in my office with the door closed, Priya having quietly cleared the rest of my afternoon without needing to be asked, and for a moment nobody said anything at all, The only sound the soft hum of rain still falling against the windows 9 floors above the garage where their car had idled for so long. My mother finally set the manila envelope on my desk, her hands trembling so badly the paper rattled slightly against the wood, and told me, in a voice that cracked halfway through the sentence, that she did not know how to begin explaining 20 years in 5 minutes, but that she needed me to know, before anything else, that not a single day had passed without her thinking about that October night and what it had done to me. I did not open the envelope right away. I sat there, arms crossed, watching two people I had spent half my life trying not to need, waiting to see whether whatever came next would be an apology or something else entirely, because some instinct, sharpened by years of learning exactly how this family operated, told me that an envelope this thick, carried in with hands shaking this badly, was not simply a letter of regret. My father cleared his throat and said the words that would begin unraveling everything I thought I understood about that October night, telling me, quietly, that Marcus was in serious trouble, the kind of trouble that involved forged signatures and a bank threatening to take the house on Maple Ridge Lane, and that they had come to me, after 20 years of silence, because they no longer knew where else to turn. I felt something harden in my chest the moment my father finished that sentence, a specific, familiar coldness I recognized from every dinner table conversation of my childhood, where Marcus's problems had somehow always become everyone else's emergency to solve. 20 years, I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, 20 years of silence, and you finally show up at my office not to apologize, but because Marcus needs money. My mother flinched visibly at that, opening her mouth to respond. But it was my father who spoke instead, telling me, in a voice thick with something that sounded almost like shame, that I had misunderstood, that the envelope was not a request for money at all, that what was inside it was something he should have told me 20 years ago, and had spent every single day since regretting that he had not. I picked up the envelope then, my hands steadier than his had been, and pulled out a small stack of papers, old bank statements from 20 years earlier, a handwritten note in my father's unmistakable handwriting, and a photocopy of a betting slip dated 3 days before that October dinner where $200 had gone missing from a sock drawer. I stared at that betting slip for a long moment, the numbers and dates slowly rearranging themselves into a truth I had never once considered in 20 years of turning that night over in my mind, understanding, with a sudden, sickening clarity, exactly whose hands had actually taken that money from the envelope in the sock drawer. My father's voice was barely above a whisper when he finally said it out loud, confirming what those papers had already told me, that he was the one who had taken that money, to cover a gambling debt he had been too ashamed to admit to anyone, especially my mother, and that when questioned about it at that dinner table, he had made a choice in the space of a single silent moment that he had spent every day since trying and failing to forgive himself for. He said he told himself, that first night, that he would correct it in the morning, that he would find a way to explain everything once the anger in the house had settled, and that morning had simply never come, because the longer he stayed silent, the more impossible the truth became to speak out loud, until silence itself became the only thing he knew how to offer me. I sat perfectly still, staring at a man who suddenly looked far older and smaller than the father who had once closed a door on me without explanation, feeling something enormous shift inside my chest. Not quite forgiveness, not yet, but something that made the last 20 years rearrange themselves into a shape I had never once considered. I had spent 2 decades believing my parents had chosen Marcus over me out of simple favoritism, out of a preference for one child that had always existed and finally revealed itself that October night. What sat on my desk now told a very different story, one where my father's cowardice, not any genuine belief in my guilt, had cost me my childhood home, and where my mother, I would soon learn, had spent years searching for a way back to me that my father had quietly, deliberately blocked at every turn. My mother reached across my desk then, her hand hovering just short of mine, not quite touching, as though 20 years of distance had taught her not to assume that privilege anymore. She told me, her voice finally steady enough to hold a full sentence, that she had written to me 3 times over the years, letters she had given to a mutual acquaintance to pass along, hoping I would read them even if I never responded. I felt my stomach drop at that, because I had never received a single letter, not once, in 20 years, and I watched my mother's face crumple as she realized, in real time, sitting across from me in that office, that whatever she had written had clearly never reached me at all. It was my father who finally admitted, his voice barely audible, that he had known about those letters. He told me that Ruth Callahan had accepted them on my mother's behalf over the years, unsure at first whether passing them along would help or hurt me, and had eventually decided to hold them until she felt certain I was ready, a decision Ruth had made quietly, protectively, exactly the way she had protected me every day since that October night. I sat with that revelation for a long moment, understanding suddenly what that half-mentioned letter years earlier, the one Ruth had folded back into her cardigan pocket without explanation, calling it something from your old life, had actually been. Ruth had been carrying my mother's attempts at reconciliation silently for years, weighing, in her own careful way, when or whether I was strong enough to hold that weight myself. My father continued, explaining that even after those letters, even after years of watching my mother's quiet grief over a decision he alone had caused, he had remained too afraid to reach out directly, telling himself repeatedly that too much time had passed, that I had clearly built a life that no longer needed him in it, that reaching out now would only reopen a wound he had no right to disturb. What finally forced his hand, he admitted, lowering his eyes to the desk, was not courage or clarity, but desperation. The bank's letter about Marcus's forged signatures arriving the same week he finally understood he could no longer protect his son from consequences without confronting, once and for all, the truth he had been hiding from his daughter for 2 decades. I sat in silence for a long time after he finished speaking, the rain still tapping steadily against my office windows, watching 2 people who had once seemed impossibly large in my life now sitting small and fragile across my desk, waiting for a verdict I was not yet certain how to deliver. 20 years of anger did not simply dissolve because a betting slip finally explained a mystery I had carried since I was 17. But something had shifted, undeniably, in the shape of the story I had told myself for 2 decades, and I understood, sitting there in that quiet office with rain falling outside, that whatever came next between us would require me to decide not whether my father's cowardice could be excused, but whether the truth he had finally found the courage to speak was enough to begin, carefully and on my own terms, something that might eventually resemble reconciliation. I asked them to leave that afternoon, not out of cruelty, but because I needed space that neither of them could give me sitting 3 feet away in my own office, watching my face for a reaction I was not yet ready to perform. My father nodded, understanding immediately in a way that surprised me, gathering the papers back into that manila envelope with hands that had finally stopped shaking. My mother lingered a moment longer at the door, telling me quietly that whatever I decided, whatever I needed, she would understand, before finally following my father out toward the elevator, leaving me alone in an office that suddenly felt too large and too quiet for everything I had just learned. I called Ruth that evening before I called David, sitting in my car in the parking garage where my parents' Mercedes had idled hours earlier, needing to hear the voice of the one person who had actually shown up for me before I could process anything else. Ruth was quiet for a long moment when I told her what my father had confessed, and then she admitted, her voice heavy with an apology 20 years overdue, that she had made the decision to hold those letters not to control my life, but because she had watched me finally build something stable and did not know, in any given year, whether reopening that wound would help me heal or simply tear something back open that had only just finished closing. I told her I understood, and I meant it, because Ruth Callahan had never once made a decision about my life that was not rooted entirely in protecting me, even when that protection meant carrying a burden silently for years that was never truly hers to carry. I drove to Ruth's house that night instead of my own, sitting at the same kitchen table where she had once wrapped a towel around my shivering shoulders, and I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest since I read that betting slip, whether she believed my father deserved any chance at all to be part of my life again after everything. Ruth took her time answering, the way she always did with questions that mattered, and finally told me that forgiveness was never something owed to the people who hurt you. It was something you gave, if you chose to give it at all, entirely on your own terms and your own timeline, and that nobody, not even the person who raised me with more love than my own parents ever managed, had the right to tell me what that timeline should look like. I did not sleep much that night, lying awake beside David while Sophia slept down the hall, running through 20 years of memory with a new lens I had not possessed that morning, understanding that the story I had told myself for 2 decades, the simple story of parents who chose one child over another out of plain favoritism, had always been more complicated than that, shaped as much by my father's cowardice and my mother's helplessness against it as by any genuine preference for Marcus. That complexity did not erase what had happened to me on that porch. It did not undo 18 months of Ruth's kitchen table standing in for the family dinner table I had lost. But it did mean that whatever came next, whatever conversation I decided to have with my parents in the weeks ahead, would need to hold space for a truth far messier than the simple villain and victim story I had carried with me since I was 17 years old. I did not reach out to my parents for nearly 3 weeks after that afternoon in my office, needing time to sit with everything that had shifted before I could decide what, if anything, I wanted to say next. David never once pushed me during those weeks, understanding, the way he always had, that this was a decision only I could make on my own timeline, though he did gently suggest, one evening while we cleaned up after dinner, that whatever I decided, I should make sure it was something I could live with in 20 more years, not simply something that resolved the discomfort of the present moment. It was Sophia, in her own unknowing way, who finally pushed me toward a decision. She asked me one Sunday afternoon, entirely out of nowhere while we sat coloring together at the kitchen table, whether she had grandparents like her friend Emma did, the kind who sent birthday cards and came to school plays. I remember setting down my crayon, looking at my daughter's open, curious face, and understanding that whatever anger I still carried toward my father, whatever grief I still felt on my mother's behalf, none of it was Sophia's to inherit. She deserved the chance to know her grandparents, if they were capable of showing up for her the way they had ultimately failed to show up for me, and I owed it to her, if nothing else, to find out. I called my mother the following week, choosing her deliberately over my father, because whatever role she had played in that October night, she had spent 20 years trying to reach me while my father had spent 20 years hiding. We met at a small coffee shop downtown, neutral ground, neither Ruth's kitchen table, nor my office, nor the house on Maple Ridge Lane, and I watched my mother's hands shake around her coffee cup the entire conversation, 20 years of things unsaid finally spilling out between us in fragments, apologies and explanations that did not excuse what had happened, but did, slowly, begin to fill in a picture more complicated than the one I had carried alone for 2 decades. I asked her directly about Marcus, about the bank, about whatever situation had finally forced my parents to my door after 20 years of silence, and my mother told me the full truth without flinching this time. That Marcus had forged my father's signature on 2 loans over the previous 3 years, using the family home as informal collateral in conversations with a private lender who was now threatening legal action, and that my parents stood to lose the only home I had ever known, the house on Maple Ridge Lane, within the month if the debt was not addressed. I sat with that information for a long moment, understanding that whatever reconciliation I chose to build with my parents, It could not include simply writing a check to bail Marcus out of a mess he had created through the same entitlement that had shaped our entire childhood, and that if real change was going to happen in this family, for the first time in 37 years, Marcus was finally going to have to face consequences instead of watching everyone else absorb them for him. I told my mother, sitting across that small coffee shop table, that I was willing to help her, specifically her, separate from whatever situation Marcus had created for himself, but that my help would come with conditions I was not willing to negotiate. I would consult a real estate attorney I trusted to look at refinancing options for the house itself, protecting the roof over my parents' heads without funneling a single dollar toward Marcus's forged loans directly. But Marcus, I told her clearly, was going to face this on his own terms, whatever those turned out to be, because 30 years of this family absorbing consequences meant for him was exactly the pattern that had cost me my adolescence, and I was not willing to spend my adulthood extending it. My mother cried at that table, not the desperate tears of someone pleading for more than I was offering, but something quieter, something that looked almost like relief, and she told me that she had spent years quietly hoping someone in this family would finally hold Marcus accountable, that she had simply never had the strength to be that person herself. I understood, watching her, that my mother's failures toward me had never come from cruelty exactly, but from a kind of learned helplessness inside a marriage where my father made the real decisions, and she had simply absorbed whatever direction he set, a dynamic that explained without excusing the woman who had stood at that kitchen window 20 years earlier, washing a dish, refusing to turn around while her daughter stood locked outside in the rain. I met with my father separately, 2 days later, at Ruth's kitchen table of all places, a choice I made deliberately, because I needed him to sit in the one room in this entire story that had actually been safe for me, the room where a stranger had shown him what real parenting looked like. I watched him take in that kitchen, the same lemon-yellow curtains, the same worn wooden table, and something in his face told me he understood exactly why I had chosen this location for what came next. I told him plainly that I was not prepared to offer forgiveness on that particular afternoon, that 20 years of silence did not dissolve in a single confession, no matter how difficult that confession had clearly been for him to make. What I offered instead was a single condition, one I had spent the previous 3 weeks turning over carefully in my mind. My father would tell Marcus the truth, directly and completely, about that October night 20 years earlier, admitting in front of the whole family, including me, that he had let his 17-year-old daughter absorb blame for a debt he alone had created. Marcus needed to understand, finally and unambiguously, exactly what his golden child status had cost someone else, and my father needed to be the one to say it out loud, not to punish him further, but because that truth, spoken plainly after 20 years of silence, was the only foundation solid enough to build anything real on going forward. My father agreed without hesitation, and for the first time since that black Mercedes had idled outside my office building weeks earlier, I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, not forgiveness yet, but the possibility of it, finally within reach. The family dinner happened 3 weeks later, at my father's insistence rather than mine, held not at the house on Maple Ridge Lane, but at a small private room in a restaurant downtown, neutral ground my father had chosen deliberately, telling me quietly beforehand that he no longer felt he had the right to summon anyone back to that house until he had earned it. I arrived with David beside me. Sophia left with a babysitter for what I suspected might be a difficult evening, and found my mother already seated, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and Marcus standing near the window, arms crossed, wearing the same expression of bored entitlement I remembered from the day he had shown up at Ruth's house 20 years earlier to tell me our parents had done what was best. My father waited until we were all seated before he spoke, and I watched Marcus's expression shift from mild irritation to genuine shock as our father laid out, plainly, and without softening a single detail, exactly what had happened that October night 20 years earlier, the gambling debt, the missing $200, the silence he had chosen at that dinner table that let a 17-year-old girl absorb blame for his own failure. Marcus's face went through several expressions I had never seen him wear before. Disbelief, then something that looked almost like shame, and finally, when our father finished speaking, a kind of anger I recognized immediately, not directed at himself, but at the situation itself, as though the truth being spoken aloud was somehow an inconvenience rather than a reckoning 20 years overdue. Marcus tried, briefly, to minimize it, saying that he had been a kid too back then, that he could not be held responsible for a conversation he had not even fully understood at 17 years old himself. I let him finish, and then I told him, calmly, that I was not asking him to apologize for a childhood he had not controlled. I was asking him to sit with the fact that he had come to Ruth's house that same year, as a legal adult, and told me directly that our parents had done what was best, that I should stop making things difficult by staying angry, knowing, even then, in some capacity, that something about our family story did not fully add up. Marcus had no answer for that. He simply sat back in his chair, quiet for the first time in the entire conversation, and for the first time in my memory. Nobody in that room rushed to fill his silence or soften his discomfort on his behalf. The conversation that followed was not neat or fully resolved by the time we left that restaurant. Marcus did not offer the apology I had spent 20 years imagining, though something in his posture, in the way he avoided my eyes for the rest of the evening, suggested the beginning of a reckoning he would need far longer than one dinner to complete. What mattered more to me, sitting at that table watching my father finally speak an uncomfortable truth out loud in front of the son he had spent 30 years protecting, was that the pattern itself had finally broken, publicly and irreversibly, the pattern of silence protecting the wrong person while consequences fell on someone who had done nothing to deserve them. I drove home that night with David's hand resting on mine across the console, understanding that whatever came next for this family, healing or continued distance, it would at least now be built on truth instead of the silence that had defined every relationship in that house for as long as I could remember. The months that followed unfolded slowly, in the deliberate, unhurried way real change actually happens. Nothing like the tidy resolution I might once have imagined as a teenager standing locked outside that front door. Marcus, faced finally with the full legal consequences of his forged signatures, worked out a repayment arrangement with the private lender through an attorney, one that required him to take a steady job for the first time in years and slowly, painfully, begin rebuilding a financial life he had spent 3 decades avoiding responsibility for. I did not offer to help him with any of it, and my father, to his credit, did not ask me to. Marcus called me twice that winter, brief, awkward conversations that did not resemble reconciliation exactly, but did not resemble the entitled dismissal of our last real conversation 20 years earlier either. Small, uncertain steps towards something that might eventually become an actual relationship between siblings. My mother and I built something steadier and faster than I expected, meeting most Sundays at that same coffee shop downtown, conversations that gradually expanded from careful, guarded small talk into something that occasionally resembled real closeness. She met Sophia for the first time on a bright afternoon in early spring, kneeling down in my studio's small reception area to look my daughter directly in the eye, telling her, with tears she did not bother hiding, that she was the luckiest grandmother in the world to finally get to know her. I watched that meeting from a few feet away, feeling something in my chest that had been clenched tight for 20 years finally begin to unwind, not because the past had been erased, but because my daughter was being given something I had never had, a grandmother fully present and unwilling to let anything come between them again. My father's path back was slower, exactly as it should have been given everything he had cost me. I did not invite him to meet Sophia for nearly 6 months, wanting to see, in that time, whether the accountability he had shown at that restaurant dinner was sustained or simply a single dramatic gesture born of desperation. He surprised me, in that stretch of months, showing up reliably for the small, unglamorous efforts that actually rebuild trust. A card for Sophia's school achievement that he heard about secondhand through my mother, a message checking in without any request attached to it, a quiet acknowledgement, offered once and never repeated as though seeking credit, that he understood exactly how much he still had to prove. He met Sophia finally on her 9th birthday, standing somewhat awkwardly at the edge of a backyard party filled with children he did not know, holding a gift he had clearly spent real thought choosing, a sketchbook and a set of professional pencils, the exact kind of gift that told me, without him needing to say it directly, that he remembered exactly what art had meant to the daughter he had once let stand locked outside in the rain. I watched him kneel down to Sophia's height, introducing himself carefully as her grandfather, watched her study him with the open curiosity of a child meeting someone new, and felt something settle in my chest that I had genuinely not expected to feel again after that October night 20 years earlier. Not full forgiveness, not yet, but something real enough to build on, something that looked, for the first time in 2 decades, like the actual beginning of a family instead of the ending one. A year passed after that birthday party, and by the following October, almost exactly 21 years since that first rain-soaked October night on Maple Ridge Lane, I found myself hosting a dinner at my own house, something I would not have believed possible standing on that porch as a 17-year-old girl clutching a suitcase in the cold. Ruth sat at the head of my table that evening, exactly where she belonged after everything she had given me. Her silver hair a little thinner now, her hands a little more careful, but her presence in my life as steady and essential as it had been the night she first wrapped a towel around my shivering shoulders. My mother sat beside her, the two of them talking easily now after months of careful, deliberate friendship. Two women who had once been strangers connected only by their love for the same abandoned girl, now genuinely fond of each other in their own right. My father's chair sat empty at that particular dinner, not because he had been excluded, but because he had chosen, that specific evening, to attend a support meeting instead, part of a program he had quietly enrolled himself in months earlier to address the gambling that had started this entire story 2 decades before. I remember my mother mentioning it to me with a mixture of pride and lingering worry, telling me that he had gone every single week without missing one, that he had told her, in a rare moment of full honesty, that he owed it to me, to Sophia, and to himself to finally face the thing he had spent 30 years running from instead of simply asking forgiveness and hoping the underlying problem would quietly resolve itself. I found, sitting at my own table that night, that I respected his empty chair more than I might have respected his presence, because it told me his accountability had moved beyond a single dramatic dinner conversation into the slow, unglamorous work of actually changing. Marcus arrived late that evening, as he often still did, though he arrived at all now, which itself represented a distance traveled I would not have predicted a year earlier. He brought his girlfriend, a quiet, kind woman named Jenny who worked as a nurse, and seemed to bring out something steadier in him than I had ever witnessed growing up in that house. He was still Marcus, still occasionally too quick to make a joke when the moment called for something more sincere, but I watched him help Sophia clear plates without being asked that evening, watched him listen, actually listen, when our mother spoke, small shifts that told me the reckoning at that restaurant table a year earlier had planted something real, even if it was still growing slowly. I stood in my kitchen for a moment that evening, watching the noise and warmth of that dinner spilling from my dining room. David laughing at something Jenny had said, Sophia showing my mother a drawing from her sketchbook, Ruth patting my mother's hand across the table in a gesture of easy affection I never could have predicted 20 years earlier. I thought about that 17-year-old girl standing locked outside a different house entirely, soaked through and disbelieving, certain in that moment that she had lost everything that mattered. I understood, watching this imperfect, hard-won gathering in my own dining room, that she had not lost everything after all. She had simply been forced, far too young, to build something better from scratch, and 21 years later, imperfectly, slowly, and entirely on her own terms, she finally had. If you're still with me, thank you for staying through every part of Claire's story, because what happened in that dining room did not erase what happened on that porch 20 years earlier, and it was never meant to. Some wounds simply do not work that way. What Claire built instead was something more honest than a fairy tale ending. A family reassembled not through easy forgiveness, but through hard, deliberate accountability. Each person forced to face exactly what their silence or their entitlement had cost someone else before any real closeness could be earned back. I think often about the particular lesson buried inside a story like this one, because it is easy, watching from the outside, to reduce 20 years of pain into a simple villain and a simple victim, a cruel family and a wrong daughter. The truth Claire eventually uncovered was messier than that, and in some ways more painful precisely because it was messier, because her father's cowardice was never really about hatred toward his daughter, and her mother's silence was never really about preferring one child over another so much as it was about a woman who had learned, over years inside her own marriage, that she was not allowed to ask certain questions out loud. None of that excused what happened to a 17-year-old girl locked outside in the rain. But understanding it, finally, after 2 decades, was what allowed Claire to choose forgiveness on her own terms instead of carrying that porch inside her chest for the rest of her life. What stays with me most about this story is Ruth Callahan, a woman with no legal obligation to anyone, who simply saw a child suffering next door and refused to look away, who carried the weight of unanswered letters for years rather than risk reopening a wound before Claire was ready, who sat at the head of a dinner table 20 years later, not as a footnote in someone else's family story, but as the true architect of the family Claire actually got to keep. If this story teaches anything, perhaps it is this, that the people who show up consistently, without fanfare, without being asked twice, are very often the ones who end up mattering more than the family we are simply born into. Claire's father is still attending those meetings, still doing the slow work nobody applauds, still earning back, one ordinary Tuesday at a time, a trust that took 30 seconds to destroy on a rainy October night, and will likely take the rest of his life to fully rebuild. Marcus is still growing into a man capable of sitting in discomfort instead of deflecting it. And Claire, 38 years old now, watches her own daughter grow up in a house where every door stays unlocked, where love is never conditional on being convenient, and where the story that began with a suitcase on a porch has finally, imperfectly, become something worth passing down. If this story moved you even a little, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story we have to tell.